Welcome back to Tongue of the Serpent. If you're just joining us, this is a story of haunted objects, old bargains, and the city of New Orleans doing what it does best, smiling politely until the veil thins behind your back. At the heart of it all is the crew of the Morning Star, a shop where the lost, the cursed, the curious, and the desperate all tend to arrive sooner or later. By now in the season, the city has already begun to show its true teeth. Strange things have crossed thresholds. Old powers have stirred, and the people at the center of this story are learning that nothing in New Orleans stays buried simply because someone wished it would. Tonight's episode stands beautifully on its own, but it carries the same dark pulse as everything that came before it. Grief, memory, consequence, and the uneasy tenderness of people trying to protect one another in a world that rarely plays fair. The door beneath the cypress. A city of thin places. New Orleans possesses places, older kinds, quiet bargains between land and water, between the living and the dead, between what is seen and what is politely ignored, not the sort signed in ink and filed downtown. Most cities have boundaries, sidewalks, neutral grounds, property lines, curfews. New Orleans has suggestions. There are places here where reality wears thin, like velvet rubbed the wrong way. Old wells with stones that remember hands lowering buckets. Church vestries where the air tastes of candle smoke, even when no one has prayed there in 50 years. Collapsed cemeteries that have sunk into the earth like tired lungs. Storm drains older than the streets above them, built back when men believed the world could be mastered with brick and confidence. In those places, doors can happen. Not wooden doors with hinges and keys, but the other kind. The kind that opens because something on the far side heard you exist and decided it would like to meet you. Once there was the order that watched such places, the Order of the Purple Veil. They belonged to the oldest kind of authority, the kind that sealed, shuttered, and silenced. They closed doors. They locked mirrors. They burned books that wanted to be read out loud. The order was gone now. It burned years ago in a fire that consumed more than timber and stone. And yet, on certain nights, when the humidity hung like a damp shawl over the Marigny, a small figure still moved down narrow streets in violet-tinted robes, silent as a held breath. Sister Mercy walked because someone must. She paused beside a cypress tree that had bullied its way through cracked pavement and claimed the sidewalk as its own. She listened, and from beneath the roots, from beneath the city's thin skin, she felt it. Something shifting, something trying to open. Sister Mercy's life in the Marigny. Morning in the Marigny arrived gently, as if it was unsure of its welcome. Light slid through lace curtains. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor's radio muttered the weather with the wary certainty of a man describing inevitable sorrow. The air already smelled faintly of river and jasmine and yesterday's frying oil. Sister Mercy's cottage was small and vivid. Every inch of it was intentional, the way a knife is made for purpose, even when its handle is carved beautifully. A table sat in the center room with bowls of salt arranged like pale moons. Old ritual diagrams, drawn by hand, were stacked and weighted at the corners with smooth stones. A shelf of herbs lined one wall, bundles tied with twine, their names written in careful script, as if they might forget themselves. In the corner was a locked wooden chest, dark with age. She never opened it. Some doors, she had learned, were best left closed, even when you were the one who owned the key. Mercy woke before the city fully remembered itself. She moved through a routine older than her cottage, older than New Orleans, older than the name she answered to. Salt across the windowsill, oil across the threshold, and a whispered prayer drawn from older roots, even when it wore the borrowed cadence of Christianity. The order taught that prayers were tools, and tools could be sharpened, reshaped, made to fit the hand that wielded them. She still wore the robes, but out of a lingering sense of duty, not from a lingering sense of devotion. Years ago, the Order of the Purple Veil burned. She remembered the fire. She remembered screaming. She remembered running, but nothing else. The years before the blaze were missing, cut clean from her mind like pages torn from a book. She did not know why the blankness was there. She only knew it existed, a silent room in the house of her memory, locked from the inside. Mercy tied back her hair, fastened the charm at her throat, and felt it tremble once, sharply, like a startled heartbeat, a ward reacting to something nearby. The work continues. Mercy kept a notebook the way other people keep prayer books or diaries or grudges. The cover was colorful and lovely because Mercy had always understood that beauty and seriousness were not enemies. Rain and thumbprints and salt had marked the pages, but only the way devotion marked a thing. It was, in its way, holy. Inside was a map of New Orleans, drawn by hand, imperfect and intimate as any truth. Streets curved where they should be straight, distances compressed. The river looked like a bruise. Marks bloomed across it in dark ink. St. Louis Cemetery No. 2 had 3 notations, one for the mausoleum that tried to become a mouth, one for the grave that would not stop singing, and one for the small, stubborn mirror someone left on a tombstone like an opening. An abandoned convent had a circle around it, thick and heavy, the way you circled a name you did not want to speak again. Drainage tunnels were sketched in beneath the streets, because Mercy had learned the city has more underneath than most people would like to admit. A boarded house near the river had a single mark and a note in her precise handwriting. Do not enter alone again. Each mark represented a door she had sealed. These were often doors you could not see. Sometimes they were only a pressure in the air, or a recurring dream that wasn't dreaming about you. Tonight's disturbance was new, and that was never good news. It came from an old cistern beneath a ruined courtyard, one of those forgotten pockets of the city that no one visited unless they're lost or looking for something they shouldn't. Mercy felt it like a change in weather behind her eyes. For now it started as a pressure, but monsters only waited to grow stronger, hungrier, before they broke through. It might be a presence, a something leaning close to the membrane of the world, waiting for a mistake, waiting for a curious soul, waiting for a name offered up carelessly in the dark. She set her tools out on the table and checked them with the calm of someone who had learned panic is a luxury. A small vial of salt, an iron charm, dull and heavy, an obsidian knife that drinks the light, wax seals stamped with the order's sigil, each one wrapped carefully, as if it might bruise. She drew on her gloves, not to avoid dirt and grime, but because she had learned that some things can crawl through skin as easily as through doors. Mercy closed the notebook, pressed her palm over the cover, and murmured to the empty room, to the city, to whatever might be listening. The veil still stands, even if only one woman held it. The door beneath the cypress. The courtyard was one of those forgotten pockets the city grows when no one is watching. You could walk past it 100 times and never notice it, the way you could live beside a grief for years and only recognize it when it finally stood up and cleared its throat. The gate hung half open, rust blooming along the hinges like a slow disease. Old brick walls leaned inward, tired, as if the place had been holding its breath since the day the townhouse collapsed, and decided it would rather be rubble. A cypress tree owned the center, spontaneous, possessive. Its roots had pushed up through stone the way the dead push up through language, demanding room. They coiled and knotted and buckled like pavement into ridges, pale wood exposed to air. Spanish moss dripped from branches like a tired curtain, and beneath all of that, at the heart of the courtyard, an iron grate set into the ground, round, heavy, pitted with age, a forgotten cistern. Mercy stepped closer and immediately felt it, the wrongness. The air was too cold, as if something had been hoarding winter down there. The humidity that usually wrapped New Orleans like a damp handkerchief had thinned, leaving the skin prickling. Even the sounds of the city felt a fraction further away, muffled, as though someone had pulled a veil over the world. The world felt slightly tilted, out of sync, just enough to make you question whether your own body has agreed to gravity. Mercy knelt beside the grate. The air was slick with condensation. It smelled faintly metallic, and beneath that there was another smell, subtler, older, like river mud turned over after a long time. She didn't touch it yet. She listened. At first there was nothing but her own breathing. Then something shifted in the dark below. A whisper rose through the iron, as intention reverberating gently through her bones, without sound or words. It was want distilled down to its purest form, hunger without teeth, reaching without hands. Something below was trying to remember the shape of speech, the way a drowning person tried to remember the shape of air. Mercy exhaled once through her nose and uncorked the vial of salt. The salt poured out in a thin, white stream, and she drew a circle around the grate, careful and unbroken. The line shone faintly in the dim light, bright as bone. The whisper changed immediately. It noticed the boundary. It pressed against it. Mercy felt it as a pressure in her skull, like invisible fingers testing the seams of her thoughts. The space around her grew taut with unseen attention. Her ears rang softly. The charm at her throat went rigid with vibration. Images flickered behind her eyes like mirrors, tilted at impossible angles, reflecting faces that didn't belong to any body, of bones arranged in spirals, patient and deliberate as handwriting, of hands reaching up through dark water, pale fingers spreading like flowers that should not grow there. Mercy kept her voice steady. The order taught steadiness rather than bravery. Courage was unreliable. It came and went, but steadiness was a choice you could make even when your hands were shaking. She began the old purple veil binding prayer. Smoke and something mineral lingered on her tongue, syllables older than the city, older than the church that once tried to gentle them into obedience. The words formed in the air and settled into the salt line like hooks. For a moment, the strain loosened. The whisper retreated, sulking back into the cistern. The courtyard warmed by a degree. The world righted itself, almost. Mercy continued anyway, because she had learned that doors were not closed by hesitation. Then the pressure returned, harder, as if whatever was below had decided politeness was no longer necessary. The iron grate trembled, gently, just a small vibration, like a throat clearing. The whisper sharpened into something closer to a voice, still not quite human, but trying on the idea. And then very softly, almost tenderly, it said, "Mercy." Her name, spoken as if it had been tasted. Mercy's breath caught. The salt line flared faintly, as though offended. The grate lifted half an inch. A cold breath rose from the darkness below, slow and intimate, like something waking up and exhaling for the first time in a long while. Memory fractures. The moment the cistern breathed, something in Mercy broke loose. The pressure in her skull spiked and became a hook, catching on a hidden seam in her mind, and yanking. For a heartbeat, she was no longer kneeling beside an iron grate in the Maroney. She was somewhere else, somewhere beneath stone, a great chamber under a monastery, wide enough for voices to gather and echo, without ever touching a wall. The air tasted of incense and damp rock. Violet-robed sisters stood in a circle, their hands lifted, their faces pale in candlelight. Their voices wove together in chant, steady as rope. The floor was marked with sigils burned into stone. At the center stood a door made of many mirrors, a patchwork of reflective surfaces stitched into a standing shape that should not exist. The mirrors did not reflect the chamber properly. They showed other rooms, other angles, other skies. They showed hands pressing from the other side. Mercy was there too, older and younger at once. Her robes heavier, her charm hotter against her skin. She heard her own voice inside the chant and realized she knew every word. Then the fire came, hungry, brutal. Flames licked up the walls as if the stone itself had learned how to burn. Smoke roared through the chamber, thick and black, swallowing candlelight, swallowing prayers. Someone screamed her name, "Mercy!" The sound was torn open, raw with panic and command, as if naming her might tether them to the world. And beneath that scream, smaller, thinner, almost drowned by the crackle of burning beams, a child wailed, a cry that made Mercy's chest hurt with a recognition she could not explain. She tried to turn toward it, but the memory was collapsing, folding inward like a paper thrown into water. The chamber smeared into smoke, the mirrors warped, the chanting turned to a roar of nonsense, then blankness, a clean, merciless cut. Mercy gasped, and the courtyard slammed back into place around her. Her hands were gripping the iron grate so hard her nickels ached. The salt circle had broken where her knee had dragged through it. Her charm knocked once against her collarbone, then held there, tense as a warning. Her voice came out rough, unsteady. "I closed you once," she said, not sure if she was speaking to the cistern or the memory or the hole in her mind. "I know I did." For a second the whisper below was silent, as if considering with an edge of cruelty, a sound like wet paper tearing, a pressure like a smile forming in the dark, and the voice, closer now, hungry with familiarity, breathed up through the half-lifted grate. Not well enough. Closing the door, Mercy refused to flinch. Fear was something the body does on its own, like sweating or shivering. It was not a decision. The order taught you that. The decision came after. The decision was what you do with the fear once it arrived and settled on your shoulders like a wet cloak. The whisper below the grate laughed without sound. Not well enough. Mercy inhaled slowly, tasting damp brick and river rot and the faint metallic tang of old iron. She looked at the salt circle, at the place where her knee speared the line. A broken boundary was an invitation. A flaw was a mouth. Then we do it properly, she said, this time. She reached into the folds of her robe and drew the obsidian knife. In the dim courtyard light, it looked like a shard of night that had learned to hold an edge. She turned her left palm up, as if offering it. Then she cut just enough. Simple, shallow cuts. The ritual mattered more than the amount. Blood beaded up, dark and bright against her skin. The scent of it seemed to wake the air. Mercy let a few drops fall onto the salt circle. The salt hissed softly, a sound like an offended prayer. The line brightened, reignited, awakening with presence, the boundary remembering itself. The charm at her throat calmed into a steadier thrum, as if reassured by the oldest currency there was. Below, the cistern answered. Water churned. It began to boil with presence and intent, as if the water had suddenly realized it had something alive inside it and wanted to get away. Bubbles slammed against the underside of the iron grate. The metal trembled harder now. Something large pressed upward. The courtyard grew colder once more. Shadows stretched up through the grate's openings like fingers searching for purpose, long and slick as wet ribbon. They curled, testing. They reached toward Mercy's ankles. Mercy spoke the old closing words, ruthlessly, intently. They were a command, written in sound. The order's true purpose was never banishment. That was simply the kinder story people told themselves, because exile implied distance. It implied safety. It implied that if you pushed a horror far enough away, it might lose the trail back to your world. The Purple Veil had learned a harsher truth. Some things could not be driven out. They could only be contained. You did not scatter or dissipate their energy, no. You sealed them in like rot behind plaster, like a storm behind a locked door, like a name you refused to speak. The pressure in the air swelled, resisting the words as if the words had teeth. The iron grate bent, a slow, sickening warp. Mercy felt the line between this world and the other, stretching thin as skin pulled too taut. She stepped forward and slammed the obsidian knife into a gap between the cracked courtyard stones near the grate. The blade bit deep, and as it did, the sigil carved into the knife's hilt flared to life. Pale violet light ignited along the salt circle and threaded through the cracks in the courtyard stones, racing like lightning in reverse, binding instead of breaking. The shadows recoiled, snapping back as if burned. The boiling water below went suddenly still. The pressure in Mercy's skull spiked, then snapped like a thread cut clean. The iron grate slammed down with a force that shuddered through the courtyard, through the cypress roots, through the bones of the city. Silence dropped hard, without another whisper, no longer a voice speaking her name with a smile in the dark. The ordinary sounds returned, cautiously, like animals creeping back after a gunshot. Mercy staggered once, catching herself on the cypress trunk. She pressed her bleeding palm to her robe, leaving a dark print that would not wash out properly. The door was sealed, but Mercy knew what the order knew. Doors remembered. They remembered the hands that shut them. They remembered the voice that commanded them closed. And in the dark, beneath the iron, something waited with infinite patience, rehearsing her name like a hymn. Passing the crew of the Morning Star. Later, Sister Mercy walked through the French Quarter as if she had never bled in her life. The city was loud here, festive and glittering, as though it believed brightness could overwrite anything. Gaslight flickered across antique windows. Tourists drifted in little herds, laughing too freely, hands full of cheap beads and expensive drinks. Music leaked from doorways and thin golden ribbons. Mercy passed them like a shadow with a purpose. On Royal Street she slowed. She felt a sudden shift in the air. There was a shop there that is not merely a shop. It felt like a mouth held politely shut. The sign read, "Crew of the Morning Star." Through the glass, she could see shelves crowded with objects that hummed faintly, the way certain insects hummed right before they stung. There were objects that should not see the light of day. These were things that pretend to be harmless until you looked away. Mercy studied the name of the owner, Lucien Devereaux. She had heard it before. In certain circles, his name possessed weight. Some spoke it with reverence, others with fear, many with the weary resignation of people who knew the city was full of collectors, and only some of them were honest about what they collect. Some said he gathered dangerous things. Some said he kept worse things from gathering you. Mercy murmured, almost to herself, a collector of doors. She considered entering, feeling for one brief moment the pull of curiosity. Then she turned away decisively. Instead, she crouched, quick and unobtrusive, and with the tip of her obsidian knife, she carved a small, protective sigil into the brick inside the doorframe, tucked where the gaslight wouldn't catch it unless you knew to look, just in case. Back in the Marigny, Mercy washed her hands in a basin that had seen more blood than it deserved. The water ran pink, then clear. The cottage was quiet. The wards along the windows glowed faintly, bright enough to reassure the darkness that it was being watched. Mercy sat at the edge of her bed. The locked wooden chest waited in the corner like a sleeping animal. Her fingers hovered over the lid. Inside were objects from the order, relics, tools, evidence, possibly answers. She turned away, afraid of what she might remember, afraid of the child's cry in the smoke, afraid of the voice screaming her name, afraid of the reason she tore the last years from her mind and left the whole behind. Mercy pulled her hand back. She extinguished the candle with 2 fingers and whispered the old vow into the dark. The veil stands, even if only one sister remained. Outside, somewhere beneath the city, a sealed door shifted slightly, still closed, but remembering the sound of her voice and the shape of her name. You've been listening to Tongue of the Serpent. That was The Door Beneath the Cypress, a story that takes us deeper into the city's hidden machinery, where old vows still hold, old dangers still breathe, and silence is never quite empty. In New Orleans, there are always forces at work beneath the visible world, and not all of them have stopped listening. If you've been following the season, then you already know the pattern. What seems buried is rarely gone, and what feels sealed is often only waiting. We'll see you next time.